The words did not feel real inside my head. Elena Romano. I stood frozen in the middle of Sebastian's penthouse while thunder rolled faintly beyond the giant windows overlooking Chicago. My pulse hammered so hard it blurred the edges of everything around me. Marco remained near the doorway without moving, his expression unreadable now in a way that told me this was worse than I understood. Sebastian stared at me like the entire world had tilted sideways beneath his feet. "Who called you?" he asked again quietly. I could barely breathe. "I do not know." My voice sounded distant. Weak, an older woman, Sebastian crossed toward me slowly, his storm-grey eyes fixed completely on mine. What exactly did she say? I tightened my grip around the phone until my fingers hurt. She said my mother was Sofia Romano. Silence crashed through the penthouse. Heavy enough to feel alive, Sebastian closed his eyes briefly, like the words physically hurt him to hear out loud. When he opened them again, something inside his expression had changed. Not shock, grief. "Boss," Mark said carefully from across the room. Sebastian lifted one hand slightly without looking away from me. Marco fell silent immediately. I stared at Sebastian while my chest tightened harder by the second. "Tell me this is not true." He said nothing. That terrified me more than if he had shouted. "Sebastian," my voice cracked now, "please." He looked toward the windows overlooking the storm-dark city before finally speaking. "Your mother's real name was Sofia Romano." The room spun violently around me. I backed away one small step instinctively. "No, Elena, no." Tears blurred my vision instantly. My mother worked in a book Sunday. She watched old movies while folding laundry. My breathing turned uneven. She was not part of this. Sebastian's jaw tightened painfully. She tried very hard not to be. The answer shattered something inside me completely. I pressed one trembling hand against my mouth, trying to stop myself from falling apart in front of him. Every memory of my mother suddenly looked different now. Her fear, the locks, the moving. The constant watching over her shoulder whenever we walked home at night. She had spent my entire life hiding from a world I never even knew existed. "Why would she lie to me?" I whispered. Sebastian's eyes softened slightly despite the tension hardening the rest of his face. "Probably for the same reason she disappeared." "Which is?" His gaze lowered briefly toward the silver necklace still clenched in my hand. "To keep you alive." The words hit harder than anything else tonight. Tears slid down my face before I could stop them. I hated crying in front of people. Trevor used to call me dramatic whenever I cried. Weak, emotional. But standing inside Sebastian Romano's penthouse at nearly 5 in the morning, while discovering my dead mother belonged to the family controlling Chicago's underworld, felt larger than grief. It felt like losing my entire identity in real time. Sebastian noticed the moment my breathing became unstable again. Of course he did. He crossed the remaining distance between us carefully, like approaching something fragile. "Sit down." I shook my head immediately. "Do not tell me to calm down. I was not going to." His voice stayed low, steady. "You are allowed to fall apart for a minute." Something about the gentleness in his tone nearly destroyed what little control I had left. I looked away from him fast. "Did you know?" I whispered. "Before tonight?" Sebastian hesitated. That hesitation answered me before he even spoke. "Not for certain." I laughed once through tears. Sharp, disbelieving. "That means yes, I suspected there was a connection after I saw the necklace." I stared at him. "And you still brought me here?" "Yes. Why?" For the first time since meeting him, Sebastian, not physically, emotionally. "Because the second I saw your mother's eyes in yours," he said quietly, "I knew I would never leave you unprotected." My chest tightened painfully again. Marco cleared his throat softly from across the room. "Boss." Sebastian looked toward him without moving away from me. "What?" "We found another file connected to Sofia." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Marco stepped forward slowly, holding a weathered envelope sealed inside clear protective plastic. My pulse stumbled. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately, even from across the room. Sebastian saw my reaction. His expression darkened slightly. "Where did you get that?" "Private storage unit under Sofia's original name," Marco answered carefully. "Opened 2 hours ago." Fear slid cold through my stomach. "Somebody else knows about the storage unit?" Marco nodded once. "We were not the first people there." Sebastian went completely still beside me. Dangerous stillness. What was missing? Marco looked directly at him before answering quietly. "Everything connected to Elena's birth records." The sunrise over Chicago looked cold from 30 stories above the city. Pale grey light spilled slowly across the penthouse windows, while the storm finally weakened into scattered rain against the glass. I had not slept for a single minute. I sat curled into the corner of Sebastian's enormous couch, wearing one of his dark sweaters because my own clothes still smelled like rain and panic. The sleeves covered half my hands. The scent of cedarwood lingered faintly in the fabric and somehow made everything harder to process. Elena Romano. The name repeated endlessly inside my head like something my mind refused to accept. Across the penthouse, Sebastian stood near the window, speaking quietly into his phone while Marco reviewed files spread across the kitchen island. Both men looked exhausted now, the kind of exhaustion that comes from years instead of sleepless nights. "Lock down every remaining storage location under Sophia's name," Sebastian said calmly into the phone. "Nobody enters without my approval." Silence followed while he listened. Then his expression darkened. "I do not care who authorized it. Shut it down." He ended the call sharply before rubbing one hand across his jaw. For a second he simply stood there, staring at the city below like he could already feel something collapsing around him. I watched him quietly from across the room. Everything about him looked different now that I knew the truth. Not because he changed, because my understanding of him had. He was not just the dangerous stranger who answered a desperate text message anymore. He was my mother's family, my family. The realization still felt impossible. Marco glanced toward me carefully before speaking. "We found one item still left inside the storage unit." He slid the weathered envelope closer across the marble counter. Sebastian looked at it for a long second before finally turning toward me. "You should open it." My pulse quickened immediately. I stood slowly and crossed the penthouse toward the kitchen island. The envelope looked old enough to fall apart if handled too roughly. My mother's handwriting covered the front in faded blue ink. Elena, just my name, nothing else. My throat tightened painfully. Sebastian remained beside me without speaking while I carefully opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside sat 3 folded letters tied together with a pale ribbon and a small silver key taped beneath them. Tears burned instantly behind my eyes again. "She wrote to you," Sebastian said softly. I nodded without trusting my voice. The paper shook slightly in my hands as I unfolded the first letter. "My sweet girl, if you are reading this, then the past finally found you." My vision blurred immediately. I swallowed hard and kept reading silently while the penthouse disappeared around me piece by piece. "Your real name is Elena Sofia Romano. I wanted you to grow up far away from fear, power, and the darkness attached to our family. I wanted you to know bookstores instead of bodyguards, pancakes instead of funerals, safety instead of loyalty built on fear." A broken sound escaped my throat before I could stop it. Sebastian looked away instantly, giving me privacy even while standing only inches beside me. I continued reading through tears. Sebastian was always the good one. Even as a child, he carried the weight of protecting everyone around him. "If he finds you one day, trust him carefully. He belongs to a dangerous world, but his heart was never meant for cruelty." My chest tightened so hard it hurt to breathe. I looked up at Sebastian slowly. He stood motionless beside the windows now, staring toward the city with his jaw clenched tightly enough to hurt. The morning light softened the sharp edges of his face for the first time since I met him. Suddenly, he did not look untouchable anymore, just tired, deeply tired. "She loved you," I whispered before realizing I said it out loud. Sebastian closed his eyes briefly. "Your mother saved my life." His voice sounded rougher now, more human, more than once. Silence settled heavily between us again while I unfolded the second letter. This one contained only a short sentence beneath the date, written 20 years earlier. "If anything happens to me, the key opens the bookstore basement." My pulse stumbled instantly. I looked down at the small silver key taped beneath the letters. "The bookstore?" Sebastian turned toward me immediately. "What bookstore?" I stared at the key in my hand while memories slowly surfaced through the exhaustion. My mother used to take me to an old bookstore downtown when I was little. My breathing quickened. After she died, it was abandoned. Marco looked towards Sebastian sharply. "Sophia owned property under another identity." Sebastian's eyes locked onto the key instantly. Dangerous focus returned to his expression all at once. "Address?" I gave it quietly. Marco immediately pulled out his phone. But Sebastian remained staring at the key in my hand. "If Sophia hid something there," he said softly, "then she never intended for the truth to stay buried forever." Then his phone buzzed again. He checked the message once before his entire expression darkened instantly. "We are too late," he said quietly. "Someone already broke into the bookstore an hour ago." Chicago looked colder in daylight. By the time Sebastian's convoy pulled onto the empty downtown street, the rain had faded into a pale grey mist, hanging low between buildings like the city itself was exhausted. I sat beside Sebastian in the back of the SUV with my mother's letters folded tightly inside my coat pocket and the silver key resting cold against my palm. Nobody spoke during the drive. Marco rode in the front seat checking messages every few seconds while Sebastian stared silently out the rain-streaked window beside me. The closer we got to the bookstore, the heavier the air inside the vehicle became. I finally understood something terrifying about Sebastian Romano. The quieter he became, the more dangerous the situation actually was. The bookstore sat wedged between an old laundromat and a boarded-up cafe on a forgotten Chicago side street. Faded gold letters still clung to the dusty front window. Bellamy Books. My chest tightened painfully the second I saw it. Memories surfaced instantly. My mother buying me hot chocolate from the tiny cafe corner inside. Sitting cross-legged between shelves while she read quietly near the window, the smell of old paper and cinnamon candles. For years I thought the place disappeared because business failed. Now I realized my mother abandoned it intentionally. Sebastian stepped out first, his dark coat moving sharply in the cold wind while two black SUVs parked behind us. Marco scanned the nearly empty street before nodding once towards Sebastian. Perimeters secure. Sebastian opened my door himself without a word. The small gesture should not have affected me anymore after everything that happened last night, but it still did. I stepped onto the wet sidewalk, clutching the silver key tightly enough to leave marks in my palm. Up close, the bookstore looked wounded. One front window was cracked. The door hung slightly uneven on its hinges. Somebody had definitely been here before us. Sebastian noticed my expression immediately. Stay close to me. Not controlling, protective, automatic. We entered together. The tiny bell above the bookstore door still chimed softly despite everything. The sound nearly shattered me emotionally. Dust floated through pale morning light, spilling across overturned shelves and scattered books. Somebody had searched the place aggressively. Drawers pulled open, framed pictures smashed, cabinets emptied onto the floor. My stomach turned slowly. They tore this place apart. Marco crouched near the back office studying damaged locks. Professionals. Sebastian moved carefully through the ruined bookstore like a man walking through a graveyard. His storm-grey eyes scanned every detail with controlled focus. But underneath that focus, I saw something else now. Grief. Real grief. He stopped beside a faded photograph still hanging crookedly near the register counter. I walked closer carefully. The picture showed my mother years younger, standing beside a teenage Sebastian outside this exact bookstore. His arm rested awkwardly around her shoulders while she laughed at something off-camera. My breath caught instantly. Sebastian stared at the photo without moving. "She kept this?" he asked quietly. "I never saw it before." His jaw tightened slightly. "She used to force me to help organize books every summer." One corner of his mouth almost lifted. I hated it. The softness in his voice hurt somehow. I studied the younger version of him in the photo. Even at 16, Sebastian already carried sadness behind his eyes. "She looked happy with you." Sebastian looked away first. That was before everything collapsed. Silence settled heavily around us again. Then Marco spoke sharply from the back office. "Boss." The atmosphere changed instantly. Sebastian crossed the bookstore in seconds with me, close behind him. Marco stood near an old wooden trapdoor, partially hidden beneath a fallen rug. Fresh scratches marked the lock. My pulse quickened immediately. "The basement," I whispered. Sebastian's eyes moved toward the silver key in my hand. "Open it." My fingers trembled as I knelt beside the trapdoor. The key slid into the lock perfectly. A loud click echoed through the bookstore the second it turned. Sebastian's hand moved instinctively against the small of my back while Marco lifted the heavy door carefully. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below, carrying the faint scent of old paper and dust. Narrow stairs disappeared beneath weak yellow basement light still glowing after all these years. "Somebody restored power recently," Marco said quietly. Sebastian's expression hardened instantly. "We are not alone here." Fear tightened across my chest again. But beneath the fear was something else now. Determination. My mother hid this place for 20 years. Whatever waited downstairs mattered enough for people to break into apartments, destroy bookstores, and hunt through old storage units searching for it. Sebastian looked down toward the basement before turning toward me slowly. "You do not have to do this." I stared at the darkness below us while my pulse hammered hard against my ribs. Then I looked back at him. "I think my entire life has been leading here." For one brief second, something almost like pride flickered behind Sebastian's exhausted eyes. Then the moment disappeared as he reached for a flashlight near Marco's coat. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. And together, we descended into the darkness my mother spent 20 years trying to hide. The basement smelled like dust, old wood, and secrets buried too long underground. Weak yellow lights flickered softly above us as Sebastian led the way down the narrow staircase with one hand holding the flashlight and the other positioned subtly near my back like he was prepared to pull me behind him at any second. Marco followed close behind while the bookstore above creaked quietly in the morning wind. Every sound inside the basement felt amplified, my breathing, the footsteps, the distant dripping of water somewhere behind the walls. When we finally reached the bottom step, I stopped moving completely. The room looked untouched by time. Shelves lined every wall filled with neatly organized boxes, faded photographs, old journals, and stacks of documents tied together with ribbon. A small lamp glowed beside an antique desk covered in handwritten notes. Somebody had preserved this place carefully for decades. My chest tightened painfully. "My mother built all this," I whispered. Sebastian slowly scanned the room with unreadable eyes. Sophia always planned 3 steps ahead. His voice sounded softer down here somehow, more personal. I stepped farther into the basement while dust floated through the weak light around us like tiny ghosts. Family photographs covered one wall near the desk. Real photographs, not the polished fake life I grew up believing. Sophia standing beside Sebastian as teenagers. Sophia holding a baby wrapped in a pink blanket while an older man in a dark suit stood behind her with one hand protectively on her shoulder. My stomach dropped. The man had Sebastian's eyes. "Your father," I whispered. Sebastian stopped beside me, staring at the photograph in silence. Yes, I looked at the baby again. "That is me." Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. 25 years of lies sat framed on a basement wall beneath a bookstore hidden in downtown Chicago. I suddenly understood why my mother looked exhausted for most of my childhood. Carrying secrets this large would break anyone eventually. Marco crossed toward the antique desk and carefully opened one of the drawers. "Boss!" Sebastian walked over immediately. I followed more slowly while my pulse climbed again. Inside the drawer sat a stack of sealed envelopes arranged beside an old cassette recorder and several photographs spread across a map of Chicago. One photograph had a red circle drawn around a man standing outside a black sedan. My breath caught instantly. "I know him." Sebastian looked toward me sharply. "Who?" I stared at the photograph harder, trying to steady my voice. "He came into the pharmacy 3 weeks ago." The atmosphere changed immediately. Marco stepped closer. "Are you certain?" "Yes." The man looked older now, but I recognized the silver tie clip and narrow face instantly. Sebastian picked up the photograph slowly. Every trace of warmth disappeared from his expression. "This is Antonio Romano." Cold moved down my spine. "Romano?" Sebastian nodded once without taking his eyes off the picture. "My uncle." Silence swallowed the basement again. "The same uncle who took over after your father died?" I asked quietly. Sebastian's jaw tightened. "Yes." Marco carefully opened one of the envelopes beside the recorder. Inside sat financial records, photographs, and handwritten notes in Sophia's handwriting. Sebastian took one page immediately, while his eyes darkened more with every line he read. "She knew," he said quietly. "Knew what?" He lifted his gaze toward me slowly. "Antonio orchestrated the betrayal 20 years ago." The words settled into my chest like ice. "Your own uncle destroyed the family?" Sebastian laughed once under his breath, bitter, exhausted. "Power makes monsters out of weak men." I watched him carefully then. The controlled Mafia boss standing in front of me suddenly looked like someone carrying grief far too long alone. "Why did my mother run?" I whispered. Sebastian looked toward the photograph of Sophia holding me as a baby. "Because she discovered Antonio planned to erase anyone connected to my father's bloodline." My throat tightened painfully. "Including me, especially you." Fear crawled slowly through me again. Not the panicked fear from my apartment bathroom anymore. This was heavier, older somehow, like stepping into a nightmare that began before I was even born. Marco suddenly stiffened beside the staircase. Someone entered the bookstore. Every muscle in Sebastian's body tightened instantly. He killed the flashlight beam without hesitation, plunging half the basement into shadow. Footsteps creaked faintly above us. Slow, careful, more than one person. My pulse thundered painfully in my ears. Sebastian moved in front of me automatically, blocking me from the staircase with his body, while Marco quietly positioned himself near the basement wall. The entire room held its breath. Then a familiar male voice drifted down from the bookstore above. Calm, dangerous. "Sebastian." My blood went cold instantly. Sebastian's expression hardened into something lethal and unreadable. "Antonio," he answered quietly. Silence followed, then another creak above us. "You should not have brought the girl back to Chicago." The sound of Antonio Romano's voice inside the bookstore above us changed the entire atmosphere underground. Every light in the basement suddenly felt colder. Sebastian stood perfectly still in front of me, one hand slightly extended behind him like an invisible barrier, keeping me protected without touching me directly. I could not see Antonio yet, but somehow his presence filled the entire building, calm, controlled, dangerous in a quieter way than Sebastian. "You always were predictable," Antonio called down from upstairs. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "The second I heard Sophia's storage unit had been opened, I knew where you would go next." Marco glanced towards Sebastian, carefully waiting for instructions. Sebastian never looked away from the staircase. "How many?" "At least 4 upstairs," Marco whispered. My pulse hammered painfully against my ribs. The basement suddenly felt much smaller than before. I tightened my grip around my mother's letters while trying to stotist instantly. Without looking back at me, he spoke quietly. "You are okay." The certainty in his voice grounded me for half a second. Above us, slow footsteps crossed the bookstore floorboards. "You should not have involved the girl," Antonio continued. "Sophia died protecting her from this world." My throat tightened immediately hearing my mother's name spoken by the man who destroyed her life. Sebastian's expression darkened visibly. "You lost the right to speak about Sophia 20 years ago." Silence answered him briefly. Then Antonio laughed softly upstairs, not loudly, somehow worse because it sounded genuine. "You still blame me for your father's mistakes. My father trusted you. Your father was weak." The words hit the basement like ice water. I saw Sebastian's jaw tighten instantly. For the first time since meeting him, his calm looked strained around the edges, dangerous cracks forming beneath control. Antonio continued speaking casually like two businessmen discussing old history instead of family betrayal. "The organization needed someone willing to make difficult decisions." Sebastian's voice dropped lower. "You murdered your own brother." My stomach turned sharply. Upstairs, silence followed again. Then Antonio answered softly, "I saved the empire." Something inside Sebastian shifted at those words. I felt it even standing behind him, not rage exactly. Worse, old grief finally turning into certainty. Marco subtly moved closer to the staircase. "Boss." But Sebastian lifted one hand slightly again. Above us, footsteps stopped directly over the basement entrance. "You know what Sophia's mistake was?" Antonio asked quietly. "She believed blood mattered more than survival." My chest tightened painfully. "She spent 20 years hiding a child because she could not accept reality." Sebastian finally spoke again, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "And what reality is that?" Antonio's answer came instantly. Every breath left my lungs at once. The basement tilted emotionally around me. Sebastian moved before I could even process it fully. 1 second he stood calm in front of me. The next his voice filled the basement with terrifying coldness. "Do not say her name again." Real silence followed that, the kind where even the air feels frozen. Then Antonio sighed softly upstairs. "There it is." His voice lowered slightly. "The same weakness your father had." Sebastian's shoulders went rigid. "You think protecting people makes men weak. I think attachment destroys judgment." My pulse stumbled unevenly because suddenly this conversation was no longer only about family history. It was about me. Antonio saw it too. Silence. "You brought her into your life." Another silence. "Now look at yourself." I looked up at Sebastian then, really looked at him, the exhaustion beneath his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. The way he instinctively kept positioning himself between danger and me every second since entering this basement. Antonio's voice softened almost sympathetically upstairs. "You are becoming exactly like your father." Something flickered across Sebastian's face at those words. Pain, real pain. Then it disappeared beneath control again. "My father died protecting his family," Antonio answered immediately, "and you will lose yours the same way." Before anyone could react, darkness swallowed the room instantly. My breath caught sharply. Above us came the sound of movement across the bookstore floor. Fast footsteps. Sebastian's hand found my wrist immediately in the darkness. Strong, steady. "Stay behind me," Marco cursed softly somewhere near the staircase. Then emergency lights flickered dimly back to life in deep red shadows across the basement walls. Everything looked surreal now. Dangerous. Sebastian pulled me closer behind him while staring toward the staircase with cold focus. "He is leaving," Marco said quietly, after listening for several seconds, but Sebastian did not move. His eyes scanned the basement slowly until they landed on the antique cassette recorder still sitting on the desk beneath Sophia's files. A tiny red light blinked softly on the machine. Recording my pulse quickened instantly. Sebastian crossed the basement toward it carefully before pressing play. Static crackled through the speaker for one long second. Then my mother's voice filled the basement for the first time in 20 years. "If Antonio finds this recording," Sophia whispered shakily, "then Sebastian needs to know the truth about Elena's father." My mother's voice trembled softly through the old cassette recorder, while the red emergency lights painted the basement walls in shadow. Every person in the room stood completely still, even Sebastian. "If Antonio finds this recording, Sophia, then Sebastian needs to know the truth about Elena's father." Static crackled briefly before her breathing returned heavier this time. Emotional, afraid. Antonio did not betray the family alone. My pulse pounded violently in my ears. Sebastian stared at the recorder like he had forgotten how to breathe. "Your father discovered financial deals being made behind his back with rival organizations. He planned to expose Antonio publicly." Sophia paused for several painful seconds, but the night before he could, someone inside the Romano family warned Antonio first. Marco exchanged a sharp glance with Sebastian. "There was another person involved," Marco said quietly. Sebastian never looked away from the recorder. "Keep listening." Sophia's voice returned softer now. "Sebastian, if you are hearing this, then I failed to protect you both." Tears burned behind my eyes immediately. "Antonio threatened Elena before she was even born." My chest tightened painfully. "He believed your father's bloodline would threaten his control over the organization one day. He wanted every trace of your father erased completely." Sebastian's jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. "I ran because I could not bury another member of this family." The recording paused briefly before her voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Elena's father died trying to help me escape Chicago." Silence swallowed the basement. I stopped breathing completely for one long second. My entire life I believed my father abandoned us before I was born. That was the story my mother always told me whenever I asked questions as a child. Sebastian finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Who was he?" Static crackled softly again before Sophia answered. "His name was Daniel Brooks." The name hit me like cold water. Daniel Brooks. Not a stranger, not some forgotten mistake. A real man, a real person who died protecting us before I ever existed. Tears slipped silently down my face while my mother's voice continued through the darkness. "Daniel was kind, gentle, nothing like our world. He wanted Elena to grow up somewhere peaceful where she would never learn what the Romano name truly costs." Sebastian lowered his eyes briefly. Pain crossed his face so quickly it almost disappeared before I could fully see it. "I thought disappearing would save her," Sophia whispered. "But if Antonio found this recording, then Elena is already in danger." My breathing became uneven again. Sebastian noticed instantly even now. His hand found mine quietly in the darkness beside the desk. Warm, steady, grounding. He did not look at me while holding my hand. Somehow that made the gesture feel even more real. Sophia continued speaking. "Sebastian, if there is still goodness left inside this family, it lives inside you." The basement fell completely silent after that line. Even Marco looked away. "Protect her," Sophia whispered finally. "Not because she is Romano, because she deserves the life none of us ever had." Then the recording clicked off. Silence crashed into the basement harder than any shouting could have. I stared at the cassette recorder through blurred vision while years of confusion slowly rearranged themselves into something almost unbearable. My mother never lied because she was ashamed of me. She lied because she spent her entire life trying to save me. Sebastian still held my hand beside the desk. Neither of us moved for several seconds. Then Marco's phone buzzed sharply in the silence. He answered immediately before his expression darkened. "Boss." Sebastian slowly released my hand and looked toward him. "What?" "One of Antonio's financial coordinators disappeared 30 minutes ago," Marco hesitated, "and every offshore account connected to the Romano organization is being emptied." The room shifted instantly from grief back into danger. Sebastian's expression hardened again. "He is moving," he nodded once. "Fast." I looked toward Sebastian carefully. "What does that mean?" He stared toward the basement stairs with exhausted eyes. "It means Antonio thinks this family war is finally ending." Fear tightened inside me again. "And?" Sebastian's voice turned frighteningly calm. "It means he is preparing to erase every remaining threat before he disappears." My stomach dropped instantly, including me. Sebastian looked directly at me then. Something changed behind his eyes at that exact moment. "Decision final, absolute." "No," he said quietly, "not anymore." Marco stepped closer immediately. "Boss, we need to move now." Sebastian ignored him for one long second while staring at me under the red emergency lights. Then he spoke the words that changed everything between us forever. "I am ending this tonight." The drive back through Chicago felt unreal after everything hidden beneath the bookstore basement. Grey morning light stretched across rain-soaked streets while the city slowly woke around us, completely unaware that an empire was collapsing before sunrise. I sat beside Sebastian in silence inside the black SUV, with Sophia's letters resting against my chest beneath his dark coat. Marco drove faster than before now, checking mirrors constantly while speaking quietly into his phone every few minutes. Nobody mentioned the recording again. My mother's voice still echoed inside my head. Protect her, not because she is Romano, because she deserves the life none of us ever had. I looked toward Sebastian beside me. His expression had changed since leaving the bookstore. Harder somehow, more distant, like he had already made peace with something dangerous inside himself. What happens tonight? I asked quietly. He kept his eyes on the city outside the window. Antonio disappears if I do nothing, and if you do something, his jaw tightened slightly, then Chicago changes forever. The answer settled heavily between us. I realized then that this was never just about family betrayal. Sebastian carried an entire world on his shoulders, whether he wanted it or not. A world built on fear, loyalty, money, silence, and power. And tonight he planned to burn part of it down. The SUV finally entered the underground garage beneath Sebastian's penthouse tower. The second we stepped out, movement surrounded us immediately. Men in dark suits crossed the garage carrying boxes of files and computer equipment while security teams spoke urgently through earpieces. The atmosphere felt controlled but tense. Like everyone sensed something massive approaching. Marco pulled Sebastian aside near the elevator while I stood nearby pretending not to overhear. Several accounts already vanished overseas, Marco said quietly. Antonio emptied almost half the organization overnight. Sebastian remained calm. Let him run. Marco frowned slightly. Boss, I said let him run. Marco lowered his voice further. If you do this, there is no rebuilding afterward. Sebastian looked toward me briefly across the garage before answering. I know. Something painful moved through my chest at those words. He was really planning to walk away from everything. Not for power, not for revenge, for me. The realization terrified me more than anything else. Upstairs, the penthouse no longer looked elegant and untouchable. It looked exhausted. Files covered the dining table. Several televisions displayed financial reports and security footage, while rain continued sliding slowly across the giant windows overlooking the skyline. Sebastian loosened his tie for the first time since I met him and poured himself black coffee without drinking it. Marco disappeared into the office with two other men while phone calls echoed constantly through the apartment. I stood near the windows feeling completely disconnected from my own body. 24 hours ago I was hiding in my apartment bathroom, terrified of Trevor. Now I stood inside a billionaire penthouse while a mafia empire prepared for war around me because my mother spent 20 years protecting secrets tied to my bloodline. None of it felt real. Sebastian approached quietly beside me, holding a second coffee cup. You should try to eat slightly. I do not think my stomach remembers how. One corner of his mouth almost moved, almost. Then silence returned between us, while Chicago glowed grey beneath the storm clouds outside. You can still leave, he said quietly after a long moment. I looked at him immediately. What? I can get you out of the city before tonight. His voice stayed calm, controlled. New identity, new place. Nobody would find you. My chest tightened painfully. And you? Sebastian stared toward the skyline. I finished this. There it was. The thing he had already decided hours ago in the bookstore basement. Sacrifice. I studied his face carefully then. The exhaustion beneath his eyes. The grief he never fully showed anyone. The loneliness hidden beneath all the control. You are planning not to come back from this, I whispered. He said nothing, which answered me completely. Anger rose unexpectedly inside my chest. Real anger. You do not get to decide that alone. Sebastian finally looked at me fully. Elena, no, my voice shook, but I did not look away. You spent the entire night telling me I deserved a life outside fear while you act like your own life does not matter. Something flickered behind his storm grey eyes then. Surprise maybe, or pain. This world does not let people like me walk away cleanly. Maybe not. Tears burned behind my eyes again, but I am getting really tired of people deciding things for me in the name of protection. Silence stretched between us while rain tapped softly against the glass. Then Sebastian stepped closer, not threatening, not controlling, just tired. You think I want this? He asked quietly. I think you believe destroying yourself is easier than being happy. The words landed harder than I expected. Sebastian looked away first. That alone told me I had touched something real inside him. Across the penthouse, Marco suddenly emerged from the office with tension written clearly across his face. Boss. Sebastian turned immediately. What happened? Marco hesitated only half a second. Antonio just sent a message to every remaining captain inside the organization. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. What message? Marco looked directly at Sebastian before answering quietly. Tonight he officially names you his enemy. The penthouse grew darker as evening settled over Chicago. Heavy clouds covered the skyline again while rain tapped softly against the giant windows like the city itself was waiting for something terrible to happen. Since Marco delivered Antonio's message hours earlier, the atmosphere inside the apartment had changed completely. Phones rang constantly. Men moved through the halls carrying files and equipment. Security teams rotated every 30 minutes, yet beneath all the movement, a strange calm settled over Sebastian. Not peace, acceptance. He stood near the windows wearing a black suit again, the same controlled expression back on his face like armor he had not worn properly since the night he found me hiding in my bathroom. But now I knew him too well to believe the calm meant he was unshaken. It meant he had already decided what he was willing to lose. I watched him quietly from the kitchen while wrapping both hands around a mug of untouched tea. "You have been standing there for 20 minutes, I said softly. Sebastian glanced toward me briefly. "I am thinking that usually worries me." One corner of his mouth moved faintly before disappearing again. Silence returned between us. Outside, lightning flashed somewhere above the lake. The reflection illuminated Sebastian's face for half a second, revealing the exhaustion hidden beneath his composure. I crossed the penthouse slowly toward him. "Tell me the truth." He looked at me carefully now. "About what?" "Tonight." My voice tightened slightly. "What actually happens tonight?" Sebastian stared at the skyline before answering. Antonio gathered the remaining captains inside the organization at the old Romano shipping terminal. The name alone sounded heavy with history. "Why there? That is where my father built the empire." His eyes darkened slightly. "Antonio wants to end it there too." I studied him carefully. "And you are going alone." He said nothing, which was answer enough. Anger flared instantly inside my chest again. Sebastian's gaze shifted back toward me slowly. "Elena." "No." I set the mug down harder than intended. "You are not walking into some dramatic final confrontation by yourself like your life means less than everybody else's." His expression softened unexpectedly, just slightly. "You think this is dramatic? I think it is reckless. It is necessary." That is what people say right before they ruin themselves. The room fell silent again. Sebastian stepped closer until only a few inches separated us. "If I do not stop him tonight, Antonio will spend the rest of his life hunting you. Then we leave together." The words came out instantly before I could second-guess them. Something shifted behind Sebastian's eyes at that. "Real emotion, dangerous emotion. You still do not understand what I am connected to." "I understand enough." Tears burned suddenly behind my eyes. "I understand that every person in your life either leaves or dies because you think protecting people means carrying everything alone." Sebastian looked away briefly like the words physically hurt him. "Eleanor, do not." My voice cracked now. "Do not stand there acting like disappearing is noble." He closed his eyes for one long second. When he opened them again, the control in his expression looked thinner than before. "You think I want this life?" he asked quietly. "You think I wanted any of it?" The pain in his voice stopped my anger instantly. I was raised inside this world before I understood what fear even meant. He laughed softly under his breath, bitter, tired. "My father spent his entire life protecting everyone around him until it killed him anyway." Silence settled heavily between us. "And now you are becoming him," I whispered. Sebastian stared at me for several seconds without speaking. Then finally, quietly, he admitted, "That is exactly what terrifies me." The honesty in those words shattered something inside my chest. Before I could answer, Marco entered from the office carrying several folders under one arm. He stopped immediately after noticing the tension between us. "Sorry." Sebastian straightened slightly. The emotional vulnerability disappeared behind control almost instantly. "What is it?" Marco placed the folders onto the dining table. "Everything is ready." He hesitated briefly before continuing. "The remaining captains are already arriving at the terminal." Sebastian nodded once. "Good." Marco's eyes shifted toward me carefully. "There is another problem." Sebastian looked up. "What?" Antonio released internal files connected to Elena's identity. My stomach dropped instantly. Marco continued quietly. "Half the city now knows Sophia Romano's daughter is alive." Sebastian's entire expression darkened in a way I had never seen before. Not anger, worse, fear, real fear. "How far did the files spread?" Marco answered softly. "Every major organization in Chicago received them within the last hour." I looked towards Sebastian slowly while panic tightened inside my chest again. What does that mean? His storm-grey eyes locked onto mine with devastating clarity. It means there is nowhere left in this city where you are safe without me. 3 months later, the ocean sounded nothing like Chicago. No sirens, no helicopters circling skyscrapers at 2 in the morning. No rain hammering against penthouse windows while men whispered about power and loyalty in the next room, just waves rolling softly beyond the boardwalk every morning before sunrise. I unlocked the front door of the bookstore just after 7 and breathed in the familiar scent of coffee, paper and sea salt, drifting through the small coastal town, Bellamy Books. The name hung above the windows now in fresh gold lettering exactly like my mother once described in her letters. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floors while quiet jazz music played softly near the register counter. Peace still felt strange sometimes. Like wearing clothes that did not belong to me yet, I set a box of new arrivals onto the front table before reaching automatically for the silver necklace resting beneath my sweater. I still touched it whenever anxiety crept into my chest. Old habits survive longer than fear. The small bell above the bookstore door chimed softly behind me. "You opened 7 minutes early again," Sebastian said calmly from the doorway. I turned toward him instantly despite hearing his footsteps 1,000 times already over the past few months. Some part of me still checked to make sure he was really there. Sebastian stood holding 2 coffees while cool ocean wind moved through his dark hair. No tailored black suit anymore. No bodyguards waiting outside, just a dark sweater, faded jeans and exhaustion slowly healing from his eyes one quiet morning at a time. He crossed the bookstore toward me and handed me one of the coffee cups automatically. "You remembered the cinnamon." One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "You make the same face every morning if I forget." I smiled before I could stop myself. It still amazed me sometimes that Sebastian Romano learned how to smile at all. After Chicago, everything changed faster than I expected. The shipping terminal confrontation ended the Romano Empire in one night without the war Antonio wanted. Sebastian released every file Sofia hid, every financial record connected to Antonio's betrayal, and every secret buried inside the organization for 20 years. Half the captains abandoned Antonio immediately once the truth surfaced. The other half disappeared before sunrise. By morning, the empire controlling Chicago no longer existed in the same form it had for decades. Antonio vanished before authorities arrived at the terminal. Nobody knew where he went after that. Sebastian never tried to find him. Some men destroy themselves eventually. He told me once while packing the last box before we left Chicago forever. Antonio already started years ago. Marco took control of the remaining legal businesses and quietly dismantled everything else connected to the organization over the following weeks. The penthouse was sold anonymously 2 months later. Sebastian never went back. Sometimes I wondered if he missed any part of that life at all. But every time I looked at him here beside the ocean, the answer became clearer. He looked lighter now, still guarded, still quiet, but human in ways power never allowed before. Sebastian moved behind the counter and began arranging pastries from the bakery next door while early sunlight filled the bookstore around him. The scene felt so painfully ordinary it almost made me emotional sometimes. This man once controlled half of Chicago with a single phone call. Now he argued with me about shelf organization and forgot grocery lists twice a week. "You are staring again," he said without looking up. I know, his eyes finally lifted toward mine, softer now than the night we met. "What are you thinking about?" I walked slowly toward him beneath the warm morning light. "Honestly? Always." My throat tightened slightly with emotion I no longer tried to hide from him. "I think my mother would have loved this place." Silence settled softly between us. Sebastian glanced around the bookstore before nodding once. "She would have loved seeing you safe." The words hit deeper than he realized. I stepped closer and gently placed the silver necklace into his hand. Sebastian looked down at it in surprise. "Elena, the past does not belong around my neck forever." His fingers closed slowly around the necklace while something emotional flickered behind his eyes. "Are you sure?" I nodded once. "I do not need fear to remember who I am anymore." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Sebastian reached forward carefully and brushed one loose strand of hair behind my ear with a tenderness that still surprised me every single time. "You changed everything," he said quietly. Tears burned instantly behind my eyes. "So did you." The bookstore bell chimed again as the first customer entered from the bright morning street outside. Ordinary life. Simple life. The kind my mother sacrificed everything trying to give me. Sebastian glanced toward the front windows where sunlight poured across the sidewalk before looking back at me one final time. Do you know what the strangest part is? He asked softly. What? One corner of his mouth lifted again while the ocean breeze moved gently through the open bookstore door. Chicago feared me for years. His storm-grey eyes held mine steadily, and somehow you were the first person who ever saw me clearly. I smiled through tears while sunlight filled the bookstore around us, and the small open sign hanging in the front window swayed gently in the peaceful morning breeze.